Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Curious Mind podcast. My name is Gabriel Ellis. I'm a psychologist, a psychotherapist, and a Buddhist scholar. And I like to take deep dives into psychological topics that allow you to understand the mind better and to understand also the process of psychotherapy better. The topic that I want to discuss today is the power and impotence of the self ideal. In psychotherapy, obviously, we encounter again and again the relationship of us with ourselves, be it in the topics of anxiety, depression, problems with other people in the relationship, with family members, or at work. At each of these fundamentally important topics, we encounter the problem that we have in relating to ourselves. This is somewhat paradoxical that we can on the one hand be ourselves and on the other hand also relate to ourselves, and this relationship to ourselves can be hopefully easy and encouraging, empowering, or it can be a problem for us. Psychologists such as Carl Rogers and Donald Winnicott have mostly in the 50s and 60s distinguished between what they call a real self and a false self. The false self for them is a reaction to pressure from the outside world. And the purpose of this so-called false self is to satisfy the needs of other people. And for them, this started in early childhood when children learned that it's a necessity for them to understand the needs of their parents and sometimes to act according to their needs, to the needs of their parents, and not to their own needs. This becomes obviously highly problematic when the parents are very unempathetic towards the children, put their own needs into the foreground, don't allow the development of the children to be on their own terms, and thus dominate the whole interaction to their children, with their own needs. And the children are suffocating and cannot develop their own values, their own understandings, their own space within the family system, and always have to worry about if they have satisfied their parents' needs sufficiently. So this is the root of the false self for those humanistic psychologists and also the psychoanalytic psychologists. But there are not only negative aspects to this false self. The false self is also a protection for the true self. And we use it, children use it, but also adults, to ensure physical, social, and emotional survival. The false self can be recognized. The false self usually appears in the form of I should, I must, or I must not, or I project this should, must, and ought onto others. And another common characteristic of this false self, when it appears in these forms of I should, I must, and so on, that it weighs down the consciousness. It is usually not uplifting, but it appears as a responsibility, as something that has to be done against the intuition in the moment, and it usually feels heavy. Now, counter to those early humanistic psychologists of the 60s and some psychoanalysts who emphasized the development of this false self, we can also call it the superego, the Über-Ich in the original German. There are views that there are more opportunities for such a false self to develop. It is not only in the early childhood, but I would argue that in each breaking points in the biography, there is a possibility for the shoulds and the musts to appear. To give an example, when children start to go to school and encounter on a regular basis other children in such a formal setting, this is another breaking point, a crack point in the biography where they are insecure, they open up to how others perceive the world and might, without sufficient self-value, overemphasize the needs of the others. The same It is, of course, in puberty. Puberty is notorious for the teenagers to emphasize and overemphasize the importance to be liked by others, and thus to give them too much power, which has a strong possibility to diminish their own self-value and not to develop enough their authentic selves. This does not end in childhood and puberty. There are many more breaking points in the adult life as well. For example, in the so-called time of the midlife crisis, where again people become insecure of their own status, ask themselves typically who they are, what they want, and there are again possibilities for false selves to creep into the personality structure. Now, talking about the false self, what is the true self? And those psychologists of the early days, they emphasize that the true self is spontaneous, is in line with one's feelings, but this makes it a fleeting thing of the moment, and it makes it a plaything of the subconscious needs that are more or less satisfied in that moment. This is somewhat problematic because what people perceive as how they are authentically in this moment can vary from moment to moment. On the other hand, the positive aspects of being in tune with one's authentic self, whatever that means, has the potential to be light and carefree. And this makes sense when I refer back to what I said before, when the false self shows itself as I must, I should, I have to, or I must not, and that these thoughts usually are accompanied by heavy thoughts and by feelings of being burdened, then being in tune with one's authentic self, with the true self, accordingly comes along with light and carefree feelings. Unless deeply integrated in our lives with the values and needs, an emphasis of a true self can be difficult. If it is not integrated and still following the ideal of having to be authentic all the time, being true to myself all the time, can bring us into a lot of trouble. For example, when I live with my partner and I have the agreement with my girlfriend that we alternate cooking every day. So one day she cooks dinner or lunch, and the other day I cook. Now, let's assume it is my turn. And then I ask myself, do I really want at this moment to cook for us? And then an honest answer might be, an authentic, a true answer might be, no, actually, I want to be lazy, lie on the couch and watch Netflix. How healthy would that be for myself and for the relationship if I emphasized, if I prioritized my true self in that moment, and I would de-emphasize and deprioritize the agreement that I have with her. In cases of emergency, every once in a while, of course, we can make an exception, but to constantly prioritize myself and my true feelings and my true wishes at that moment, and to not to care about agreements, responsibilities that I have in normal life, I think it's clear to see that a consequence of that would be that in the long run, in the middle run, those relationships would suffer. I would suffer at work, I would suffer in the relationships, and I would contend and argue that I would even suffer with myself. So to use the wrong self, the false self, is functional. And it is normal to use the false self. It is very normal to use the false self to a higher degree when we navigate the world of work and income, because this is, in the end, this is a transactional field of life that we deal with. Ideally, of course, we can be also authentic, but not to a very high degree, because we have our responsibilities towards ourselves and towards our own lives to satisfy. So it is normal to employ the false self to middle average degree in the world of the work. It is also normal to employ the false self somewhat to a low to medium degree when we maintain friendships and partnerships. Because again, we want something out of these relationships. We want comfort, love, a sense of accomplishment, appreciation, all of these very fundamental human needs that depend on relationships. And I cannot neglect the bond that I have with people and the commitment that comes along with it. Even to a low degree, I need to employ a false self towards myself. And again, the false self understood in the forms of I should, I have to, I must, or I must not. Again, an example from my own life. Since childhood, I suffer from back pain. At some point, I discovered yoga for myself, and whenever I do yoga for an extended period of time, it really helps my back pain. Now, do I always and every day want to exercise? If I really ask myself authentically if this is what I want at that moment, often enough, I would come to the conclusion, no, I don't want to. I would like to slouch, or I would like to read an interesting book. I would like to talk to friends, but for sure, I would not like to, take 30 minutes, 40 minutes of my time and do my yoga exercises every single day or most of the days of the week. Now, again, if I emphasize and prioritize my authenticity and my true self, I would follow those other needs. What keeps me from doing that, and what keeps me to use the false self, my self ideal, and the I haves and the I musts, is the wisdom and the understanding of what is better for me in the long run. In psychotherapy, we encounter problems with the false self all the time. Again, the false self is actually a good means to an end, and it serves to satisfy the deeper purposes of life, not the momentary needs that I have. The deeper purposes of life are my health, my social life, love, relationships, financial security, all of these. I need and I employ the false self for these purposes. As I observe it currently, though, the false self and inauthenticity have a really bad reputation. It's almost an insult, and it's frowned upon to advocate or to use or to admit that one uses aspects of the false self, of the self ideal, of the superego, as if there is a atmosphere in society that forbids to admit that. And we have to be, this is the maxim today, we have to be as authentic as possible. Also, in psychotherapy and in self-development, I observe that the focus is on replacing actions based on the false self as much as possible, and too uncritically to replace them with actions based on the true self. And this has consequences in real life. Such an uncritical employment of a fundamental rule that only the true self is valid and we should, as much as possible, act upon the true self, leads to real life issues because it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the function of the self. The function of the self, the I, or the ego, however you want to call it, is not to maximize authenticity and thus to become a plaything of circumstances and emotions. The purpose is that it has a special task, the task to navigate the organism safely on the river of life, if you want to use that metaphor. And to do this, the I, the ego, the self has to make very complex decisions. It has to pursue different kind of goals. For example, the goals of pleasure, the goals of satisfaction, and the goals of sustainable success in all the different fields and issues in life. And in order to do that, the false self and to employ the false self and self ideals is absolutely necessary. To be authentic is one variable in this very complex calculation in everyday life, but should not be basically taking over the whole purpose. A problem with using the false self and self ideals occurs only when our navigation, the navigating the life, is too little based on our own experiences with ourselves and the experiences with the world. If we don't understand our experiences, if we don't make sense of our experiences in our world, then our actions are not based on our own true experiences. And because in the end, we have to make decisions, if we don't understand our life, if we don't understand ourselves, inevitably we have to take the criteria of other people. So we look at our parents, we look at friends, we look at YouTube celebrities, we look at self-help gurus or books of therapists and Stoics or whatever, and we use their formulas for the navigation of our lives. But this must be misleading. When we do that, when we use the formulas of others, then I've not taken responsibility for navigating my own life. And if I follow the goals and the maxims and the ideas and the formulas of others, it will not lead me to my goal. It will lead me astray. It will lead me to the wrong direction. And obviously, if I go in the wrong direction, I will be lost. And this is the common experience that I have with many people who go into therapy. They are lost and they feel lost and they don't have or have lost the connection to their inner compass. And again, this is due to not understanding oneself and not understanding one's own experiences with oneself, with other people, or with the world in general. In therapy, this becomes apparent when the mind is too busy with how people say, with how I should be, or with how my partner should be, how my family should be, or the world should be. So again, an indication of a too wrong space, too much of a space of the false self, of being lost, of not valuing and understanding one's own experiences, is when people are busied and worried with how they should be and others should be. And when they have too little recognition of others, of how others and how themselves actually are, with their limitations, with their characteristics as they are, with their needs as they are, and with their fantasies as they are. And this is why in therapy it is so valuable to use the reality as a basis for the future navigation of one's life. And this means you need to know to get to understand yourself, to get to know yourself, and in this process also to get to know and to understand the people around you. And after that, I can then take into account the real self and the false self aspects inside of me, and to make the combination, to apply them wisely to different fields of life in order to fulfill that higher purpose, which is to navigate myself, to navigate my organism into a hopefully safe and satisfying and happy future. With this approach to psychotherapy, I'm in good company, also with Hegel, the philosopher, who applies a similar principle to philosophy. In paragraph 6 of his Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he writes, and this is my translation, separating reality from ideas is particularly popular with the minds who consider the dreams of the abstraction to be something true and is vainly concerned with the should. as if the world has been waiting for them to find out how it should be. But philosophy, he continues, philosophy only deals with ideas that are not so powerless as to only should and not really be. Okay, so often the language of philosophers is complex and dense. What Hegel says here, what he claims, is that what only should be is powerless. And this is also what we can see in daily life and what I observe in therapy. If people constantly mourn and complain about work society, their partners, themselves, and so on, if they are lost in how everything should be and how they should be, how their partners should be, then they are in a position of psychological and philosophical powerlessness and impotence, which directly translates into feelings of unhappiness. The feeling of the position of powerlessness is one of the worst that human beings can be. We can observe this in animals, we can observe this in children. They get desperate and frantic when they are in positions of utter powerlessness. And to position ourselves, to position our thinking, our ruminating, mostly in the field of how another should be, automatically makes myself powerless and creates feelings of powerlessness, feelings of unhappiness. Now, if this is the starting point of therapy, of the therapeutic process, then the healthy development is to carefully work out who I really am, the realistic basis, the appreciation for who I am, and who the people around me really are, with our needs, with our hopes, with our limitations, with our characteristics. And we use this as a basis, our basis for our contemplations of what I actually want to become, who I actually want to be. Why this is healthy is that in those explorations of who I really am, automatically there is an emergence of the true potential that I have, not a false potential that is imposed on me by the ideas of others, parents, friends, celebrities, and so on. What emerges is the should and the want based on how I actually am. So what emerges is automatically integrated into my potential and into my path. And that goes along with an ease that further enables a healthy development. I hope this reflections helped you to understand the place, the value, and the limitations of the false self, and gave you an idea of what the true self can really be. I can refer you to other podcast episodes to this topic. You will find them both with reflections on philosophy, psychotherapy, and spirituality. I cover this topic a lot in the hopes that you will get a better intuition and an explicit understanding about the possibilities of the true self. Let me know in the comments, let me know in messages if you have further questions, if you have wishes, and what topics I should deal with in the future as well. Thank you for your attention.